Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
I glanced around the room at the tearful, sorrowful faces. I wasn't at all surprised by their grief. Troy had been an exceptional father, a successful businessman, a dedicated community supporter, and a loyal friend. As a husband, I couldn't have asked for anyone better. He fully embraced his role in the household, supporting my decision to be a stay-at-home mom and later my desire to dedicate time to church and volunteering. Troy had been a far more engaged father to our 3 children, Lila, Ethan, and Lisa, than most men, and it was evident in their successful lives since leaving the nest. Lila and Ethan had already moved out, and I was certain Lisa was on the verge of doing the same. I looked at my children, their faces filled with devastation, even Ethan, who was usually more composed. I was still in shock over the suddenness of Troy's passing, struggling to accept that the man I had loved completely for 32 years had left us. He had gone out for a round of golf on a bright, sunny Saturday morning and never returned. Grant, his lifelong friend and our family solicitor, had been the one to deliver the news. Troy had collapsed on the 4th tee, and although CPR had been performed, he had already passed away by the time the paramedics arrived. The official cause of death had yet to be released, but Grant believed Troy had died before hitting the ground. When Grant had tracked me down, I had my phone off, and by the time I arrived at the hospital, all 3 of our children were already there. That had only been 4 days ago, and we were all still in shock. Grant opened the folder in front of him, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Thank you all for coming today to hear the will of the late David Brown, husband, father, and the best friend I ever had," Grant said, his voice cracking. Dark circles under his eyes revealed his own sorrow. His wife, Julie, who had been a friend of mine since she met Grant shortly after my wedding, was sitting in the office that day, clearly there to support him. I had seen her hug Grant before being led to the conference room, where our children were already seated. Grant continued, his tone becoming more professional as he composed himself. "I know this may seem unusual, but it was Troy's express wish to read the will before the funeral. However, I must point out that nothing can be finalized until the full probate period has passed." He began reading the will. I didn't need to pay much attention. Troy and I had always updated our wills together. The document started with specific instructions for who would receive certain items. Ethan, our only son, was to inherit Troy's medals from his service with the Army Corps of Engineers, his beloved sappers, as Troy called them. Lila, our eldest, was to receive his rock collection. I tuned out, glancing at the somber faces of my children. Lila, at 30, seemed to be taking it all in stride, though she and Troy had always been close. When I had entered the room, I had left her alone as she stared at the wall, tears in her eyes. I remembered many conversations between her and Troy about those rocks. Lila had started a promising career in science, but it had taken a backseat when she unexpectedly became pregnant by her boyfriend of about a year. Fortunately, her boyfriend turned out to be a good guy, doing the right thing and marrying her. They've now been happily married for 5 years and have 2 beautiful kids, perfect for Troy and me to spoil. Ethan, at 28, had followed in his father's footsteps, becoming an engineer by day and an Army reservist in his spare time. How long he'd continue with that, though, was uncertain, as his wife of 2 years was 8 months pregnant with their first child. With Troy as his hero, I'm sure if it's a boy, they'll name him David. It breaks my heart that Troy won't be around to spoil his first grandchild bearing his surname. I looked at Ethan, who was staring intently at Grant. I felt for him. He looked like he had aged 5 years in the 4 days since his father's passing. Skin sallow, eyes red-rimmed. And then there was Lisa, my oops baby. Troy and I had agreed 2 children were enough, but we hadn't taken the step to make sure it was permanent. Birth control pills had always messed with my hormones, so we relied on condoms, one of which must have failed, leading to Lisa's unexpected arrival 10 years after Ethan. Troy had gotten a vasectomy shortly after. Lisa had been helping Troy in his demolition business over the summer, still living at home but spending more time at her boyfriend's house. I knew it wouldn't be long before the house would be mine again. I began thinking about what I should do with the house. Either downsize from the 6-bedroom place or hire a housekeeper and gardener to help. As for the bank accounts and Troy's life insurance, I knew I'd be comfortable for the rest of my life. I half listened to Grant's voice as he went over the details of Troy's will, knowing it had been updated just 2 years ago. Troy had left his Mustang to Lisa and his old Jeep to Ethan, with the business to be turned over to a trust managed by the children, with each of them having equal voting rights. Ethan could manage the business if he chose, for a generous salary. That seemed fair. I knew nothing about business and wouldn't need the income. I tuned out again, my thoughts drifting as Grant continued with the business details. Fond memories of Troy and our life together were helping me cope with the shock of his loss. He had been remarkable, rising from the poor background he was born into and building assets from scratch, ensuring that we would want for nothing in our lives. Then, something caught my attention. Grant's words seemed off. "Sorry, what was that last part?" I asked. Grant, looking a bit annoyed, turned the page and began rereading the paragraph I had missed. "The house is to be sold, with all profits going into a trust to be administered by Grant Baker, to be used solely at his discretion for the education of my grandchildren, Lila Baker, Ethan Brown, and Lisa Brown. To this trust will be added the entire contents of my private bank accounts, with Grant Baker having my power of attorney to access those accounts. He is also authorized and directed to cancel all credit cards held in my name." My mind was spinning. This was nowhere near what I had expected. It was completely different from the will Troy and I had updated together just 2 years ago. Had Troy secretly changed his will without telling me? What was going on here? And what about the beneficiary nomination form we'd lodged with the insurance company? The entirety of my death benefit was to be paid to Ms. Margaret Williamson. Suddenly, I was on my feet, though I hadn't consciously decided to stand. My body was operating on autopilot. Bank accounts emptied, the house to be sold, the insurance payout going to my husband's personal assistant? I think I yelled something like, "What the hell?" A heavy silence filled the room, the tension palpable. I stared at Grant, whose disgusted expression made me recoil, avoiding his gaze. I turned to his right, locking eyes with his secretary, a woman I didn't recognize. She must have been new since I was last here. The contempt in her eyes was even more cutting than Grant's. I looked away from them both, and my gaze landed on my children. Lisa and Lila sat there, staring blankly at the table. Their postures mirrored each other. Heads bent, shoulders tight, hands clasped in laps, knuckles white. Ethan was the only one who wasn't avoiding me. He wasn't just looking at me. He was glaring, his anger so intense it made me wish he would just look at the table like the others. Then, an icy thought struck me. Could they have known? In my last moments of clarity, before emotions took over, logic provided the answer my wishful thinking had been suppressing. Troy had known. He had told Grant and amended the will. That explanation made sense of the cold reception I had received upon entering this room. Grant must have briefed the children before I arrived. Call me a coward if you like, but I couldn't stay. I turned and bolted from the room. Julie was still at the reception desk, talking on the phone. A rush of relief flooded through me. Oh, how I needed a friend right now. I walked around the desk toward her, just a couple of paces away when her words sliced through my mind, still overheated from the shock. "If you check your records, you'll see that his wife's cell phone was on a contract under his name. He is deceased now, but if you give me your fax number, I can send you the power of attorney my husband was given over all his affairs." I stood frozen, stunned, as she jotted down a number on her legal pad. She still hadn't acknowledged me, finishing her call and thanking the person on the other end before hanging up. She placed the phone down, stood, and positioned the chair between us. The look of disgust on her face was gut-wrenching. "Grant showed me some of the photos Troy left in a sealed envelope to show your children. You sicken me. I hope the intimacy with your young lovers was worth destroying one of the finest men I ever knew." With that, she turned and walked into the conference room. I stood rooted to the spot, her words echoing in my head, as she hugged her husband, who, if I wasn't mistaken, was trembling. No one looked at me. No one cared about the devastation I was feeling. More alone than I'd ever felt, I fled. Once outside, I heard the ping of a text message. It was from Grant, informing me that it was Troy's express wish that I not attend his funeral. I don't know how I made it home without completely losing it. I sat on the couch, stunned. I had thought Troy loved me with everything he had. Sure, our love life had suffered in the last 10 years, slowly dwindling to nothing. But we weren't spring chickens anymore, and after 32 years, who could blame us? Then I recalled something Julie had said earlier, her words cutting through my scattered thoughts. "I hope the intimacy with your young lovers was worth destroying one of the finest men I ever knew." Lovers, plural. Oh my God. Troy had known, not only about Victor but about Ryan too. No, he couldn't have. Ryan was years ago. In no way could Troy have stayed with me all that time without confronting me. He must have known only about Victor, and Julie had made a mistake in the heat of the moment. Yes, that had to be it. But even that knowledge had shaken Troy enough to cut me out of his will and, worse, tell my children. What kind of hate would drive him to such an extreme? It was all too overwhelming. I grabbed the bottle of gin and filled a highball glass, spilling some as my hands shook uncontrollably. The burn in my throat from the alcohol did offer some relief, calming me just a little. How could Troy do this to me? I still loved him. My God. Did Troy know I still loved him? Was that part of the problem, that he thought I was going to leave him? Now that I thought about it, he had become colder over the last year or so, but I had been too caught up in everything to notice the signs. I realized I had subconsciously rationalized his emotional distance as embarrassment over his problems. Tears welled up again, threatening to spill, but I blinked them away. I needed to think. I wondered how Troy had managed to live with someone like me for the past year and a half. The pain in my chest was so physical I pressed my hands to my ribs, as if it might stop my soul from unraveling. The fear and pain Troy must have felt, thinking I didn't love him or, worse, that I was planning to leave him. How else could he have set out to destroy me like this? Wrong, Troy. I screamed into the empty room. I never loved you any less. It was just the intimacy with the others. I never meant to hurt you, and I would never have left you. I collapsed back onto the couch, devastated, haunted by the thought that Troy had died without knowing the truth. My mind briefly slipped into a numb fog, self-preservation kicking in. Brenda, are you in there? It was my sister Mary's voice, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot and her yelling through the open upstairs window that broke me from my hung-over slumber. I was fully clothed, lying on the master bed. Staggering to the window, I squinted out before heading downstairs to let her in through the back door. She and her husband had been on a cruise for the last 10 days, and as far as I knew, she hadn't heard about Troy. Brenda, are you all right? I heard about Troy, you poor thing. Why aren't you answering your phone? Her questions overwhelmed me as I stood there, reminded of my loss. Without saying a word, I let her in, wandered over to the charger, and tried my phone. It was dead. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, tears spilling over as everything came crashing back. Mary sat beside me and took my hands in hers. Oh my God, how could they leave you like this? Hang on, I'll call Lisa. Why isn't she here? Just as she reached for her phone, my loud no stopped her in her tracks. She sat there, waiting as I gathered the remaining pieces of myself, bracing for what was to come. The loss of my sister's respect along with everyone else's. Finally, I spoke. Do you remember that time about 11 years ago when Troy was doing that job for the coroner in the act? After that girl was killed during the demolition job? Mary nodded. I had been proud at the time that my husband was considered expert enough in his field to be called as an assistant investigator. He'd been away for almost 2 weeks. Well, damn, this was harder than I thought. Mary was my little sister, always looking up to me. There was this young guy, I began. He was on the same church committee as me, and we'd flirted a bit in the past. Mary frowned but stayed silent. Well, while Troy was in CRA, I agreed to go to dinner with him. Connor, his name was. He was in his late 20s and hot, if you know what I mean. The look of horror on Mary's face almost stopped me, but I took a deep breath and pushed on. I sought comfort in those memories from that time. I'm paying for my infidelity now, but twisted though it may sound, those memories of the fun I had straying from my vows are what I hold on to now, as though they somehow balance out the price I'm paying. Mary's face was pale, but I pressed on. Oh, Mary, Connor was big and energetic. He took me to his place, and he took me over and over. The guy was relentless, a battering ram of passion. I had so many good moments. Brenda, oh my God, stop. Are you here to unburden your soul or brag about the joys of extramarital affairs? At her sharp rebuke, I felt heat rush to my face. I apologized for getting off track and continued with a more detached recounting of my all-nighter with Connor, not staggering home until the following day. Mary was shocked by my betrayal of Troy in a drunken mistake, but her surprise deepened as I went on to explain that once I had quieted my conscience, I'd gone back for more, again and again. I only stopped when Connor had been blinded in a freak accident at the school where he taught chemistry. He was working alone in the lab when a glass container he was heating exploded. The combination of shattered glass and corrosive liquid from the flask destroyed both his eyes. He had only been wearing glasses, not the required face shield. After that, I lost contact with him. Mary sat there, stunned, as she processed what I was saying. So when did your affair end? She asked. The affair ended a little over 10 years ago, I replied. The weight of that sentence hung between us. That affair? She asked. Yes. Oh, Mary, you wouldn't believe how a girl's ego gets boosted at our age by having someone on the side. Someone young, attractive, and energetic, if you know what I mean. I fell into an embarrassed silence, praying Mary wouldn't press me on what her expression was clearly suggesting. I imagine, she said, judging by the smug look on your face, that the sense of superiority you got from pulling the wool over Troy's eyes was part of the reason. Mary, I sighed. I've always known you were smart. You're proving it again. I often wondered if part of my drive to find a replacement for Connor a little over a year after his disfigurement was because of the deep sense of inferiority I felt compared to Troy. I recalled that time. Sure, I wasn't a successful businessperson like Troy, but I was a brilliant parent. But then I remembered, it struck me as if it was just yesterday. Troy was both a brilliant parent and a successful businessman. Deep down, I knew that was likely the root of everything I'd done. I don't know. Maybe, I muttered. I certainly didn't want to hurt him, but you went out and found someone else, didn't you? She pressed. I looked down at the table, my shame palpable. Yes, I admitted. And this guy was young and fit, too, wasn't he? I didn't answer, but my silence said enough. Spill, she insisted. Well, Daniel wasn't entirely my fault, I began. Around this time, Troy started having issues in the performance department. I felt like I wasn't exciting him anymore, no matter what I did or how hard I tried. I was still in my prime, and that hurt. Cut the crappy self-justification, Brenda, Mary interrupted. Get to the part about going out and getting your ashes hauled by another super stud. It wasn't just about intimacy, I protested. Daniel was a nice guy. He was romantic, smart. We always had a great time. And you always ended up at his place while he satisfied your needs, right? Well, yes, I admitted. And how long did Daniel last? She asked. Until he tired of being seen out with someone old enough to be his mother? Until he wanted to settle down and have children with someone his own age? I felt the embarrassment crawl up my neck. No, I muttered. Daniel was killed after about 5 or 6 months. Killed? She asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and shock. I never really found out, I said. He invited me over for a barbecue. He was going to cook me one of the burgers he was famous for, then after some time in the bedroom, he intended to take me out to meet some of his friends at a football match. I did what I always did. I parked at the shopping center a couple of blocks away and walked to his place. But when I got there were firefighters everywhere, and his house was partially collapsed, fully on fire. I didn't know what to do. I went home. Daniel wasn't answering his phone, and the next day, I saw in the paper that the homeowner had been killed. I went back 2 days later and spoke to a neighbor. Apparently, everyone thought Daniel had been trying to light the barbecue when the gas bottle exploded. Oh, Mary, it was horrible, I said, my voice shaking. Yes, I can imagine. Having a friend killed must be traumatic, Mary replied. Yes, that too, I agreed. But it could have been me. If Daniel had waited until I arrived to fire up the barbecue, I could have been killed as well. And then, the investigators were still on the scene. The neighbor introduced me as someone Daniel knew, and they questioned me like it wasn't just a tragic accident. I kept telling them I couldn't help, but I lived in constant terror for the next few months, afraid they'd find something out and somehow Troy would discover everything. Mary looked at me, a bit disapproving. Don't look at me like that, Mary, I said. I know you think I'm a serial adulterer, and maybe even that I'm selfish, but I only wanted to protect Troy and my family from the fallout. I fell silent, lost in the fear I had lived with for those months. So, did you go back to being a dutiful wife and mother after that? Mary asked. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stop the confession right there, but I couldn't. The fact that I didn't know my husband nearly as well as I thought I did, especially considering he had somehow known about my affairs for God knows how long, shattered me. I was a Christian, but not a Catholic, so I couldn't find solace in a confessional, and the thought of unloading on a stranger was unbearable. About 3 years, yes, I said, pausing. Mary gave me a deadpan look. Mary, I don't think it was all my fault. Troy's erectile dysfunction got worse and worse. He tried, but he never made it past half-mast, if you know what I mean. And that changed him. He withdrew emotionally from me. It was horrible. I bought lingerie, tried talking dirty, but nothing worked. He started staying late at the business, working weekends. He was still great with the kids, but it felt like being with me embarrassed him or something. I paused, taking a deep breath. And then there was all the pleasure I was missing out on, especially in the bedroom. All those young, well-built men seemed to have a hold on me, so I went out and found a replacement for Daniel. His name was Jerome. He looked like a real stud, muscles on top of muscles, but I have to say, he was a little disappointing. He'd done steroids at one point, and I think that shrank his well, you know. It only lasted 6 weeks or so, and I was planning to break up with him, but before I could, he disappeared. Disappeared? Mary asked. Yes, I said. I went to his house one day, and it was empty. packed up and gone. Between you and me, I thought he had some genuine feelings for me. He could have at least called to say goodbye, but no, he just left without a word. I haven't heard from him since. I paused again, letting the words settle. After that, I hooked up with Ryan, I said. He was the best of them in bed, though. He couldn't really make love to a woman, if you know what I mean. He just took me whenever he wanted to. Oh, Mary, you wouldn't believe how good that made me feel. It was like being back in high school. Mary gave me another look of disgust, prompting me to skip some of the details. Ryan was a bad boy, or at least, he tried to appear that way. He said he ran with tough men in Melbourne. I thought he was full of lies until, well, he started getting more demanding. He said my insistence on keeping things private was cramping his style and insisted we go out in public with his friends. I only went once, to a bar on the other side of town, but I spent the entire time terrified someone I knew would see me. Plus, he started pushing for us to stop using protection. I didn't want to risk my health like that, especially knowing Ryan had other women on the side. I tried to break it off, but I just couldn't. I had grown addicted to the intimacy. I think I called him a week or so later, and he must have missed me as much as I missed him because he agreed to let me come over to his place the following Friday. So, how long did good old Ryan keep rocking your world after that? Mary asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Let me guess. When you showed up at his place on Friday, all his buddies were there waiting for you? My dejected expression seemed to soften Mary's sarcasm slightly. I painfully remembered that time. No, I said quietly. I never went to his place that Friday. His sister, who I had become friends with, called me the night before and asked if I'd seen the news. I hadn't. Turns out, Ryan had been killed in a car bombing. He really was mixed up with the wrong crowd. There was a turf war going on with local drug dealers. The news shook me to my core. It could have been me. Mary watched me, her eyes taking in the tears that had begun to fall. She didn't reach out to hug me, and I couldn't blame her. Even I wasn't sure if the tears were for my former lover or for the fear I still carried from that time, 4.5 years ago. Was he the last? Mary asked. Now came the hardest part, the confession I hadn't yet found the courage to fully face. Now Mary would know that, while my husband was receiving CPR on a golf course, I had been in bed at a seedy motel with my latest lover, happily wrapped up in the moment. My phone had been safely tucked away in my car, parked at a shopping center, which is why I was one of the last to know I had become a widow. No, Mary. Sadly, Ryan wasn't the last, I said, my voice breaking. God, this is hard. I was faithful for over 2 years this time. Then I met a new guy, someone from the church committee. Victor, not Victor Smith? Mary asked. I froze, realizing she knew him. The fact that she was familiar with him made this so much worse. Yes, Victor. He was married, with 2 little kids, I continued. I tried to break things off with him, but he started getting clingy. He said we were meant to be together, and that he would leave his wife for me. I was starting to worry he might tell Troy, just to break us up. I've been lying awake the past few nights, wondering if he called or emailed Troy. Someone told me that, just before Troy passed, he received a call. What if it was Victor? What if that's what triggered his heart attack? I gathered the courage to look at Mary's face. Her color had drained, and her mouth was moving, but no sound came out. Wait, you don't know, do you? I asked, confused. No, what? She whispered. Victor's dead. Mary, I said, my voice trembling. He died the day before Troy. Someone sent his wife a letter telling her about the affair, and she kicked him out. He went straight to the garden shed and set himself on fire with a can of petrol. I was stunned by the news. I had been so isolated in my grief after Troy's death, drinking heavily since the reading of the will, that I hadn't heard the local gossip. It seemed that no one wanted to burden me with the bad news. I glanced at Mary again. Her face had become even paler, tinged with green. He knew, she whispered, shaking her head. All along he knew. Who knew what? I asked, still confused. Mary looked at me impatiently, her frustration showing. Think about it, Brenda. Can't you see the pattern? What pattern? What are you talking about? I asked. She stared at me, her eyes full of understanding. He knew. Troy knew about all of them. All of your lovers. I shook my head, unable to speak. No, I wanted to scream, but the pain of realizing that Troy had known about all my affairs hit me like a ton of bricks. For every shake of my head, Mary nodded. Even in my distress, I was reminded of our childhood arguments. Those childish "no, I didn't. Yes, you did." Rants that would go on until one of our parents told us to be quiet. Yes, Brenda. He knew about every single one of them, Mary said. Think about it. Your first lover, Connor, blinded in the chem lab explosion. Who came next? Daniel, she added, her voice cold. That's right, she continued. Daniel died when a gas bottle exploded the day you were going to the football match with him. Then Jerome disappeared without a trace. Ryan, soon after you, and he started going public, kaboom, dead in a car bombing. And Victor, well, he was probably about to expose your affair. But no, kaboom again. He's dead. Don't you see? You can't be that blind. I remained silent, unable to speak, as the symmetry of what Mary was saying sank in. It all made such ugly, horrifying sense. If I'm right, and I'm sure I am, Brenda, Troy knew about your affairs from the very beginning. He'd either faked his problems in the bedroom to avoid sleeping with your cheating self, or he really did have trouble with it. But he kept an eye on you and your lovers, and when there was a chance your affairs would be exposed, he took action. I shook my head, trying to reject the awful truth. But he would have confronted me, I said weakly, still clinging to some delusion. Confront you? And risk breaking up his family? You know better than anyone that family was the most important thing to him. No, he would have waited until Lisa was out of the house before making a move like that. The pieces of the puzzle fit so perfectly that I knew, deep down, they were the truth, no matter how unpalatable. The man I had believed loved me completely had been setting up to ambush me the entire time, waiting for our nest to empty. It was the most devastating realization I'd ever had. I barely noticed Mary standing, but when she spoke from behind me, her words startled me. I'm going now, Brenda, she said, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. I know you need me, but honestly, you disgust me. I never would have believed this about you if I hadn't heard it from your own mouth. Besides, I have to cook Pete's dinner. With those condemning words, she left. I have no memory of what happened next, only that I was jolted awake later, finding it dark outside. The quiet noises from the bathroom pulled me toward it. I entered, and there she was, holding a clear plastic bag with Troy's hairbrush inside. What the hell? I whispered. Honey, you scared me. Why do you want that? She glared at me with a venomous expression, and I took a step back, confused and hurt by her look. What? I asked, trying to understand. When I was about 8, Dad took a DNA swab from me, Lisa said, her voice sharp. He said it was to check for genetic weaknesses. I believed him at the time, but today it hit me. He probably wanted to check that I was really his biological daughter. Her words hit me like a punch. The implications of what she was saying were like a slap to my face. Connor had been my first lover, long after I'd married Troy. But Troy hadn't known that. By the time I had processed what Lisa had said, it was too late. A glance out the window showed Lisa lugging 2 suitcases down the front path. I rushed outside just in time to see, and hear, my husband's old Mustang pull out and drive away. I had never felt so utterly alone in my life. I tried to use logic to delay the crushing emotions that were threatening to break me down. I replayed everything Mary had said, desperate to hold onto the hope that Troy couldn't have known for all those years. The only evidence supporting my wish was my belief that he was too honest and open to hide his knowledge from me. The Troy I thought I knew couldn't have faked that much love. A nagging memory surfaced, just the day before the reading of the will. I had been going through Troy's closet, searching for a suit for the funeral home, but I thought he had more clothes than this. Jumping up from the couch, I rushed upstairs to the master bedroom and flung open the closet doors again. Sure enough, the remaining clothes were scattered on hangers, creating the illusion of bulk. In that moment, I realized with shock that Troy had been quietly moving his clothes out of the house. It hit me. When Lisa finally left, Troy would have been right behind her. The burning question that seared my soul was, how long had he known? Mary's words replayed in my mind, fitting together into a disturbing, undeniable pattern. The answer was clear. 11 years. With dreadful certainty, I now understood. Troy's sexual problems hadn't been physical. Somehow, he had discovered my affair with Connor and no longer wanted to be intimate with me. It was horrible to think about. Troy had been 49 at the time. To give up intimacy at that age, just because his wife wasn't strong enough to resist the temptation of unemotional encounters with a younger man, it seemed too much to bear. But then, I realized, 11 years, he had stayed with me, endured our life together, because of those 3 innocent lives we had brought into the world. He had made a mistake marrying me, but his children were his responsibility. Leaving would have jeopardized their emotional well-being, and that was something Troy could never do. At the time I met Connor, Lila was 19, Ethan was 17, and Lisa was just 7. A cold shiver ran through me as I thought of it. Troy had intended to stay until the nest was empty, until he could walk away without causing harm to the children. But now, where were his clothes? The shame and frustration overwhelmed me. Yes, frustration. I had taken extraordinary precautions to keep my affairs hidden, but now, in hindsight, I could see Mary's logic. He must have known about Connor somehow. The timing of his sexual problems pointed to it. If he had confronted me, the facade of a happy family would have shattered. The children's welfare would have been compromised. Unable to vent his anger at me, would he have turned it on Connor? I couldn't reconcile the Troy I knew with someone capable of harming another person. It was easier to convince myself that Connor's fate was just an unfortunate accident, as I had always believed. But once it became clear what I was capable of, I realized it was exactly in Troy's nature to watch for patterns and make sure there were no repeat occurrences. What had he felt when he discovered Daniel? Devastation. No word could fully capture it. My soul cringed at the thought of him silently tracking my movements, maintaining a rigid facade for the world, burying his disappointment in me, hoping I wouldn't expose myself and reveal him for what he was, a man silently suffering while watching his wife betray him. If Mary was right, and I knew, deep down, she was, Troy had been monitoring me closely enough to know when Daniel and I were about to reach a point in our relationship where the chance of discovery was high. To protect his family, he acted. But could he kill? I couldn't believe it. More likely, the gas explosion had been intended only to maim, like Connor's accident. The 3-year break after Daniel must have been a relief for Troy, but the ongoing avoidance of intimacy made it clear. He had already passed the point of forgiveness. Then, the shock and disappointment when he discovered Jerome. The loneliness of hearing, seeing, and reading all the evidence of my betrayal, with no one to confide in, must have been unbearable. I had been careless with Jerome. We'd been indiscreet, doing it in the office and at the gym. And just before Jerome disappeared, it all fell into place. The pattern that Mary had seen immediately. How had I missed it? Troy had ignored the threat to his family until the chance of exposure became imminent. Did Jerome just disappear? Or did Troy make him an offer he couldn't refuse, to vanish without a trace? I wondered what Troy must have thought when Ryan came into the picture with such sudden urgency. Had Troy been present in the bar the night I went out with Ryan publicly for the first time? Was he sweating with the fear of exposure? Was I the only one nervously scanning the bar, watching for familiar faces, for lingering stares? If only Troy had known my resolve to never go out publicly with Ryan again, or to insist on protection. Maybe, just maybe, I could have spared his soul from the tarnish of murder for the second or third time. The 3-year break between Ryan and Victor must have been a relief for Troy. Did he hold on to the hope that he could make it to an empty nest and escape without another casualty? By that time, did he have someone to share in the decision of whether Lisa was old enough to remain emotionally unscarred if he revealed my shame and tore the family apart? I knew Victor well enough to be certain he wouldn't have felt guilty enough about the destruction of his family to take his own life, as they claimed he did. The agonizing moments he spent before walking into the shed and Troy's trap were too painful to imagine. For once, I wished and prayed there was no afterlife. Troy deserved a long, happy one. But after everything I had put him through, the logic and theories made too much sense. After 3 large glasses of gin, the only thing that didn't quiet my mind were thoughts of Troy's loneliness throughout it all. My frustration grew as I realized I would never know when he first saw through my act. How exactly had he figured it out? And when had he started lying when he said, "I love you"? The bottle of gin was empty, and as my shame twisted into a terrible conscience, I came to a painful realization. I was the one who killed or maimed those men, not Troy. Troy had only been the instrument. If I had been strong enough to keep my legs together, or at the very least discreet about my affairs, every one of my ex-lovers would still be alive or whole today. Gutted, I finished the gin and reached for the bourbon. 3 days later, still drunk, Ethan called to remind me not to attend his father's funeral. I sensed he was the one who'd drawn the short straw. After telling me this without emotion, he hung up. A glutton for punishment, I went out to the front step to grab 3 days' worth of newspapers. There it was, Troy Brown's funeral at 3 p.m. today. Open to all, but the burial was private. I may not have been sober enough to drive, but I did it anyway, not wanting to cause a scene. I stayed far from the graveside and watched from a distance. I couldn't miss the opportunity to feel Troy's spirit and offer my apology, to ask how he discovered my affair with Connor. A bottle of something sweet and sticky kept me warm as I watched Marge, Troy's longtime PA, playing the grieving widow. It hurt like hell, especially when I saw my 3 children comforting her. I realized they knew there was more between her and Troy than anyone let on. The woman dramatically sank to her knees as the coffin was lowered, and Ethan helped her up, supporting her as the last to leave the graveside. I shivered and moved closer, ready to say my goodbyes. Just as I closed my eyes, hoping to sense Troy's spirit, I heard an awful scream behind me. I turned to see Margaret charging at me, her fingers clawing at the air. I stepped back as she was subdued and led away by Ethan and Lisa. Lila lingered behind, about to leave without saying anything when I spoke up. "What's that woman complaining about? She's got millions of my dollars from Troy's life insurance. That woman kept my father alive in his last years." Lila gave me a hard look. "You can't be this stupid, can you? She blames you for taking the love of her life away. She only admitted to Dad a few years ago that she had feelings for him. Their relationship was platonic until you started cheating with that Victor guy. She says it took ages before he was willing to be with her, and she believes you destroyed his sexual confidence. She said he had real performance problems with her. She only found out after he died that he had bought black market Viagra, and she's convinced that caused his heart attack." With that, Lila turned and quickly caught up with the rest of the family. I thought about chasing after her, about telling her what I suspected about her father not being the saint she thought he was, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Everything Troy became was a result of my actions. I couldn't ruin his children's memories of him. It was all my fault. Much later, I couldn't stop thinking about Lila's revelations. Viagra. I recalled some of the things I'd done with my various lovers and imagined Troy watching them on video. The memories of what I did with Victor to keep him interested in my aging body played like a movie in my mind. Without a doubt, these actions would have completely shattered any husband's sexual confidence. This just kept getting worse. Not only had I destroyed Troy's confidence in me and forced him to live a lie for 11 years, but I had essentially denied him a love life for all those years. Now, to learn that I had left him with real performance issues that contributed to his death, it was almost too much to bear. Damn it, my bottle was empty, and I needed to get drunk again. The next 2 weeks were a blur. I used up all the cash stashed around the house to buy alcohol, and ate mostly tinned food when I bothered to check the pantry. When I checked the mail, it was filled with final demands from various utility companies. One day, a bailiff knocked on the door to serve me with an eviction notice. I left a message with Grant, begging him to let me stay, but he never returned my call, and the process kept moving forward. Calls to my children went unanswered. Was I really such a bad mother that they had abandoned me over a private matter between myself and their father? Then I remembered the enormity of my crime and the harm it had done to a good man. I realized I'd be lucky if my children ever spoke to me again. I was hungover the morning of the eviction when a smug man in a cheap suit told me I had a limited amount of time to pack. Finally, I was escorted to the front step and told a taxi had been ordered to take me anywhere within an hour's drive. I stood there for a while in a daze until Grant approached and handed me an envelope, making it clear that he didn't agree with its contents. I ripped it open, and out fell a legal document and a typed page. The page stated that Troy had left provisions for me, a small one-bedroom unit and a modest allowance to ensure I wouldn't starve. Oh, Troy, a good man to the very end. I looked at the legal document, which was a title deed, and then threw the papers down, searching the envelope for some kind of letter. Something from Troy where he could express his anger over my betrayal, something revealing how he found out about my affair with Connor, something where he might forgive me for everything. But the envelope was empty. Just then, the taxi arrived and honked. I picked up the discarded documents and looked at them again, finally understanding what they meant. The absence of a letter spoke volumes. Troy couldn't be bothered to write to me. I had been discarded. I was irrelevant. I was just a detail. I didn't even think he made provisions for me out of any sense of duty or responsibility. I think he just wanted to ensure my survival, so I could suffer longer, to experience what it felt like to lose everything of value and be left with the choice of either giving up or trying to rebuild a life. He wanted me to reflect on how I had wrecked our marriage and destroyed the best man I'd ever known. Years have passed since that day, and now, I find myself in a place I never thought I'd end up, a dilapidated trailer park on the outskirts of town. The once pristine dreams I had of a better life are long gone, replaced by the stench of stale regret and the constant hum of the neighbor's broken-down car. I can still feel the weight of Troy's absence, like a permanent scar etched into my soul, but it's become something I don't dwell on anymore. There's no more space for that kind of grief in this pitiful existence. I turned to selling myself, when the bills piled up too high and the hunger gnawed too loudly. At first, it was just to pay for alcohol. The thought of getting through the day without it was unbearable, but it didn't take long before the desperation crept in, and the money wasn't enough. A cheap motel room here, a back alley there. It was all the same. Faces I couldn't remember, lives I couldn't care to understand. I was a shell, a body for rent, and in the end, that's all I became. I knew, deep down, that the choices I made would catch up to me, but I didn't care. How could I? How could I when every time I looked in the mirror, I only saw the wreckage of everything I had destroyed? It was easier to numb it, easier to surrender to the darkness. I didn't have to feel the guilt or the shame anymore. Not when the money was flowing, not when I could escape for a moment. But the escape was fleeting. A few months ago, I started feeling sick. First, it was the weakness, then the fevers that came in waves. I thought it was just another one of my reckless habits catching up with me. I couldn't be bothered to care enough to see a doctor at first. But when the sores appeared, when my body began to betray me in ways I couldn't deny anymore, I knew. I had it. I contacted AIDS. There's no miracle cure coming for me. No more running away. It's slow, but it's happening. The weight loss has already started. My bones ache like they're hollowing out from the inside. I've stopped drinking so much. My liver isn't as cooperative anymore. But the pain is worse than the hangovers, and I can't escape it. Not this time. I've reached the end of this road, and it feels like the last chapter of a story I don't want to finish, but it's already been written. I try to hold on to the scraps of dignity I have left, but there's not much left to salvage. There are nights I think about how it could have been different, if I hadn't been so weak, so selfish. But I push those thoughts away, because they don't matter now. What matters is the hollow emptiness that fills me up when I think about the people I've lost and the life I could have had. I'll die here, in this trailer park, far from the person I used to be, far from any kind of redemption. Just another forgotten soul among the others, fading away quietly, without anyone noticing, without anyone caring. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.